Hello and welcome to the Forward Onto Dawn podcast. I'm your host, David, and I'm joined by usual co-host, Dani.
Hello.
And today we have a special guest, Haruspis. Wait. Haruspis.
Damn it, we just covered this.
Oh, why don't you introduce yourself?
So people will basically know me as somebody who writes an awful lot about Halo, basically. I began back in 2013, around the end of that year, just looking for a writing project to do over the summer, and it has since, in the 4 years that have passed, sort of exploded as to something that I do very regularly and enjoy, because, you know, it's really fun to get into the nitty-gritty details of any part of the Halo universe and talk that through with other people.
Since we're a similar Halo lore site, we aren't going to disagree. But we've actually gathered you here to talk about something that is kind of Halo lore related, but also more general Halo news. Last week, Waypoint, which is the not Halo Waypoint, but the Vice's video games sort of sub-label, came out with...
Yeah, I was confused by that as well.
Yeah, the Complete Untold History of Halo, an oral history. And it's a pretty crazy, not quite book length, I guess it would be a novella length, oral history, as it says.
Yeah, 35,000 words, I think.
Something like that.
Do you think they tricked some people to give interviews for this, thinking they were giving interviews for Waypoint, like the Halo Waypoint? I see some of the current Microsoft employees going, "Who's this? Okay, I'll just do this interview. Yeah, sure, whatever."
I assume they led with Vice, but you never know. And so it interviews 16 people. From what we know, some of the interviews, it's been in the works for a really long time. Some of the interviews are about a year old, which factors into some parts of it. But it's probably the closest we've gotten to a history of Halo. Complete history of Halo.
Complete is a very ambitious word that it uses, which isn't quite there, but it's definitely perhaps the most complete version of history of Halo that we've had thus far.
This seems like you would turn this article into the full-sized book at some point, but it's...
I think it's safe to say it's a definitive oral history in terms of from the inside perspective that we've got so far.
Yeah, and I do think probably one of the most interesting things is that, of course, it's got a lot of the big guys that everyone knows in Halo. It's got Alex Seropian, Jamie Grisimer, Marty O'Donnell spends plenty of time talking, Joe Staten. It's also got, I guess, what you would call sort of the B string, not in that the quality, but just people who have popped up in Halo but aren't probably as well known, like Ed Freeze from Microsoft Game Studio, Max Hoberman, who did Halo 2's multiplayer, works at Certain Affinity. And then it's got a couple of the now former and current 343 people like Dan Ayub and Kiki Wolfkill. It's also got some people that I don't think I've ever heard about talking about, like Stuart Mulder, who was a general manager of Microsoft Game Studios in the early days, Peter Tamte, who was Bungie's executive vice president and who I had never heard of before this story.
No, neither had I.
Yeah.
And I think there is some of the most interesting stuff, along with Ryan Payton, who I think some people, if they follow the nitty-gritty of Halo 4, know was Halo 4's original creative director, and then he wasn't. Yes. And that's probably one of the more interesting things we'll talk about later on. But yeah, as you say, it's definitely ambitious. It doesn't hit all the marks, but I think as someone who knew a lot of, like, we've gotten retrospectives on like Halo 2 and Halo, less on Halo 3. We've gotten some Halo 4 stuff. This was one of the first that really tried to bridge them all together, and it gave a lot more background detail than I think we'd gotten before.
Yeah, because for the Halo 1 and Halo 2 stuff, that's a lot of that isn't really new information, but there was stuff on 3 and 4 in particular that I think was really quite illuminating that we hadn't actually heard before. It was new information.
Yeah, and just I think a lot of the interesting stuff or the new it wasn't new ground, but just some of the details that popped up in Halo 1 and Halo 2 were really interesting, where we'd gotten the story, but we'd never gotten some of these specific vignettes that really paint a much more interesting picture than I think a lot of people believed. And I think, at least personally, I was really interested in talking about this as soon as I finished reading it, because Dani sent it my way. I wanted to talk about it because I think, for a couple of things, because it's interesting both from the 343 side, but also the Bungie era of Halo, in that, to me, it sort of comes off as the sort of, we've had this history of Halo by Bungie, and sort of like this great account, and this kind of punctures a bunch of holes in like this mythos that has kind of bubbled up and inflated over time, especially in the Halo community.
Yes, people have a sort of immaculately conceived vision for how some of these things came about, and there's a nice cold hard dose of reality to some of those perspectives, I think, in this article.
Yeah, and Dani just brought up right before we were recording that there's a follow-up from Marcus Leto, who's one of the people who was interviewed in this, and he said basically that it was clear that the author was searching for a certain angle, and it was not one that particularly would portray Bungie in a great light, and so he refused a follow-up interview. At the same time, that doesn't refute anything in the article. It's just, you kind of have to take this might be sort of the VH1 behind the music look at Halo, but it's of course just another perspective that we haven't gotten before, and not necessarily something that overwrites that immaculate conception view that we had.
It's a shame, really, because, for the author to have sort of gone into this with the intention of not so much, of wanting to make a point in a way, which sort of overrode the point of just doing the history. It's sort of like there had to be a kind of a hook for it, like, or there was this kind of negative aspect to it that we're going to focus on more than the overarching facts.
Yeah, and so I definitely think the value of this, to me as a Halo fan, comes from what it adds, not as a definitive story on its own, but what we learned that fills in the gaps from, like, as you said, we know a lot about Halo 1 and Halo 2's development, and this just slots in some interesting stuff that we hadn't known before. So do we want to kind of go through it chronologically and talk about things that stood out to us as we go?
Yeah, as an aside, first thing, I think we've really got to praise the artwork done by, I believe her name is Erica June, I think, her Twitter handle being AuraHack. But the pieces that she did for this, I was glued to the screen looking at them. The one of Installation 04's control room in particular, it's got kind of like the Transistor kind of visual style, and I really like it. I almost want to play a game with that visual aesthetic. It's just the whole glitchy, thing looks wonderful.
Glitchy look to it.
Yeah.
One of the interesting bits from the Halo, when we start out and they start talking about Halo's development, one of the interesting things is that I don't think I had realized how late Halo's story actually came together, and that it basically was just a bunch of interesting futuristic gameplay elements that hadn't even been given any real connections.
Well, you see, this is interesting because it gets into what the part of the article that's not in there regarding Eric Troutman, the guy who ran Halo's franchise team, I believe, who effectively saved the fall of Reach, the expanded universe as a whole, from being killed as Bungie wanted it back then. Eric Nyland talked about this in a Facebook post, on his blog. And he said, we owe thanks to this man for, saving such a critical aspect of the Halo universe. And Troutman had some kind of Don Corleone-esque deal where him saving the fall of Reach meant that him, Brannon Boren, and Matt Sowell, I believe, names who are also significant in Halo's history and were referenced a couple of times, they had to write the majority of Halo 1.
Yeah, that's actually, someone should really just basically take this entire article, copy and paste it, and then just annotate in these little side stories that we've gotten. Because there is that, which was another one of those, like, wait, is Bungie the bad guy stories from a while ago, where they talked about how they really hated the fall of Reach, and that they were doing this other thing, and this, which ties back into this, because one of the things that we knew, and I think this article really elucidates on, is how pissed off the Bungie rank and file were about the Microsoft acquisition. I wrote the Wikipedia article on Bungie, where they talk about how it was a huge culture shift, and they complain about where they wanted to stick them. But I had never gotten little details like the fact that they were working at one point across from the Microsoft Encarta guys, which just goes to show like how clearly this was not a good culture fit from the start, and that they had separate key cards and would tow Microsoft employees out of their parking lot.
It doesn't sound like a positive start to a relationship at all, does it?
And Marty specifically calls out Ed Fries for being one of the few people at Microsoft who started to get Bungie and probably helped the relationship last a lot longer than it would have otherwise.
Because we've seen this alluded to in a couple of documentaries where they've really sort of talked softly about that early relationship. They sort of put it down to sticking it to the man and whatever, but they don't go into the nitty gritty details. And what we see in this article is the blood and guts of that relationship, really.
Yeah. Other interesting things I pulled out was that Peter Tamty was the link to getting how they ended up showing Steve Jobs' Halo before E3 1999 or Macworld 1999, and how it ended up on the main stage. And then there was apparently they had to go after Microsoft acquired Bungie. They had to kind of go on the phone and apologize to Steve, which totally jives with what everyone talks about with Steve Jobs. It seems like something that he would do.
Yeah. It just seems like such a sudden shift, really, to sort of go, hey, you've got this game called Halo. Oh, no, sorry, you don't have it anymore.
And the other thing the article really hammers home, which had come out previously, Marty, I think, talking about it on a Bungie podcast, was the first time, I think they really explained that the Myth 2 uninstall bug, where if you installed Myth to the root section of your hard drive, I believe, and uninstalled it, would wipe everything in that part of your drive. So if you installed it in a base file part of your file system, it could destroy your computer. That it did totally hose the company financially. And that's where Tamty came in, because he was basically brought in to, hey, we're in trouble. You need to figure out how to right the ship.
Yeah, because they recalled all those copies of Myth 2, didn't they? They spent a lot of money. That's what they spent their money on.
Yeah, it said at least $1 million, and for Bungie at that time, that was a lot of money. So that Tamty...
Well, in the video game industry at the time, that was a lot of money in general.
Yeah, and so Tamty was sort of one of the missing links, I think, in the Bungie story that we didn't hear before, about how they ended up becoming this part of the max focus on gaming. And then ultimately ending up with Microsoft.
But another thing that sort of illustrates to me is, the origins of Halo, where it started out as an RTS, as a bit of a safe bet in a way in terms of genre from Bungie, because they were quite seasoned in that. And then it moved to a third-person shooter with a sort of semi-open world. And then it became an FPS. It's interesting because you'll notice how there's very little in the way of an aesthetic change across it. There are obviously things that evolved and, took more sort of, took greater form, but the color, the style, the characters, the setting, that was definitively Halo, and that very much stayed consistently recognizable, I think. And it makes an interesting statement as to how potentially experimental Halo could get with other genres in the future.
That sounds like wishful thinking from a fan there.
Oh, very wishful thinking, because every time Frank O'Connor or someone will say, hey, I had this great idea for a Halo game, but we can never make it. It's really quite sad because you hear these great ideas, and you'll even come up with great ideas in your head, like, oh, Halo could do this and it'd be awesome. But now we've got to stick to a traditional FPS, which doesn't really seem to be the core of the series for me personally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of other people too.
Us lore fans especially, we want things we can't have all the time.
One of the other little quotes I pulled out, which is interesting, is because obviously we know now that Microsoft probably would have not succeeded without Halo being its killer app. But they pull a quote from Stuart Mulder about how basically even at the time they pretty much realized that Halo was what they had best. And he brings up, we hope third parties would have some good titles. We had Halo, we had Munch's Odyssey, which does anyone remember that? That's like one of those. I only remember it because it had the weird name. Like that's all. And there was this game called Azuric that former Microsoft Chief Technology Officer Jay Allard had started, which was a piece of shit. So we knew nothing was going to come from that. And so they said it was kind of all on Halo, which is also an interesting side of things.
God, Jay Allard, that name takes me back.
This is along what we were talking about, how the story wasn't really all together until late. The fact that Marty specifically says that Joe said there was no story at the point that they were doing the E3 announcement, and so he had to come up with the music, not knowing anything about the story, which was kind of amazing.
That it was just the ancient epic.
Aliens. Yeah, which we had heard that part before, but not with the context of and there's nothing else. There's some aliens and a guy in a Jeep, and that's it.
That's about it.
And then the poll that I shared on Halo Archive when people were talking about this, the fact that at one point the shotgun was not in the game. They were going to have to cut the shotgun.
No. Oh, no.
And that is just crazy.
I would have cried if that was the case, if that ended up just, The flood levels in Halo 1, I love them to death, but they're bad enough, even with the shotgun. And the sniper doesn't do anything against the flood in Halo 1 as well, so I almost would have rather that was cut.
Although it's kind of weird to imagine Truth and Reconciliation without the sniper insertion, like totally changing that.
It's funny how we take these things for granted, just base weapons, and it was really tricky for them to implement them into the game.
And I think that's a good thing that this highlights too, is that everyone knows about how rocky Halo 2's development was, but this really focuses on how rocky it was for Halo 1, 2, and the fact that that multiplayer really wasn't, like at one point they weren't sure they were going to have a story. Multiplayer was definitely not going to be in at a long point. It's like all this stuff that we take for granted. We're like, whoa. Almost wasn't there.
I think that's a matter of retrospective on the part of fans like ourselves. We cherish those modes and features so much that we hold them up in that little pedestal of greatness, when in fact the fact that they're even functioning apparently was a matter of luck.
Oh, I did have one last thing to say about Halo 1 actually, and it was just that Halo 1's awesome and I love it. I want to go on the record and have that down. I love Halo 1.
I agree. Oh, actually, that did remind me. I had two last things written down. One, that Marty was the one who wanted to save Sergeant Johnson at the end of the game, and everyone thought that was stupid because no one was going to care about Sergeant Johnson, which could just be Marty like talking about how amazing and like Ouija board president he is. But if it's true, it's hilarious. And then also the fact that all the arrows in the backtracking levels were added because of a single tester. And I thank that tester from the bottom of my heart.
Very much so.
Saber Interactive does not get enough credit for realizing that they should add arrows in the library in the anniversary graphics, which helps me too, because I get lost way more in that level than any other one.
Oh, really? Because they put subtle lighting cues and sort of more detail in one particular area than another to sort of try and visually project the direction that you're supposed to go.
Maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. I honestly don't know, but just having the arrows was like, okay, thank you. Because I would always like get totally confused by when it jumps underneath in those little areas and I would go too far and It was miserable.
Yeah, there's like one little underground tunnel bit where there's an arrow sort of as you're facing the tunnel pointing towards one direction, and then like a meter across is an arrow pointing the other direction, and it's very clear that you've got to be in the middle of those two arrows, and that's where you need to go. I'm very grateful for that.
Okay, and so the bit about how we kind of take features for granted now kind of ties in really well to probably the most interesting thing for me from the Halo 2 bit, which I don't think had ever come out before, and that's the fact that originally Halo 2 was going to have a Warzone-like mode, and everything we love about Halo 2's multiplayer was basically an accident of the fact that they ran out of time and told Max Hoberman to make something.
It's really fun. I was laughing almost at that bit because it seems like the multiplayer part of Halo 2, not to say that it went smoothly, but it wasn't this crashing storm that was, you know, the rest of the entire rest of the game. It was like Max Hoberman was in a sort of different kind of universe.
Yeah, he was at the eye of the storm.
Everything around, yeah, and everything else around him was exploding and blowing up, and then he's just sort of like sat there twiddling his thumbs, you know, coming up with this really awesome stuff. And then, you know, everyone else is just in chaos.
Yeah, well, it kind of sounded like it might have turned out, partially why it turned out so well is that no one was paying attention and freaking out about it because they didn't really care about it. And then, so he was just sitting, iterating, polishing it, and then, oh yeah, by the way, you're now in charge of everything because we have to get this shipped. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing just how much of what we come to value of this series was a happy accident.
Yeah, you just never know now. In other Halo 2 stuff that jumped out at me, in the past, I want to say like 3 years or so, we started getting more information about some of Bungie's canceled projects, including Phoenix.
Yes.
But this, I think, was one of the first. I think Jason Jones described it as sort of like this. Oh, it was like kind of like this Minecraft thing with like real-time strategy elements, and you had a castle you could build up. And here they talk about like, well, it was mostly like a alternating sides castle siege thing, but either way, like it never really got off the ground in terms of working, but that it just became this passion project. And this is where I think one of the interesting sort of alternate theories proposed by this article comes up is that Jason Jones is really incidental to the success of Halo, even to the point where it's like basically, especially when they start talking about Halo 2, that Alex Seropian had been sort of the one keeping everyone together, managing the business. And then once Halo got huge and there were all these expectations, Bungie politics started spiking once Alex left.
Yes, and Jason went on his long sabbatical for that soul searching after the, you know, being in, well, Halo 2's development was essentially its own level of hell, wasn't it?
Yeah, and so they talk about Phoenix and Gypsum, and that they had been kicking around since CE, and Jason Jones it seems like he kind of wanted to go off and do that, but everyone kept on getting sucked back in to finish up Halo 2 in time, so those projects just never ended up anywhere, just a dustbin of history.
Interesting to see what might have come of those.
I mean, they sound kind of cool, but then again, like any game can sound cool. It's really the execution. Yeah. So yeah, that was the other bit that stuck out about that. The timeline for some of the Halo 2, Halo 3 Reach stuff starts to get screwy, but they also talk a lot about starting with the Halo 2 stuff, the Lost Peter Jackson project that came out of the Halo movie,
yes, Chronicles,
which sounds weirder than I think anyone expected.
Yeah, I remember when seeing like news items come up about that back in 2008, 2009, back when that was like, you know, in the process of, even when it was just rumors and everyone was talking about it. And I don't think I imagined it would be anything close to what is described in this article.
With this whole bit about basically like becoming Promethean, and it's like, oh my god, Prometheans. Yeah. All the lore people are like, Prometheans, Halo 3, like era, what's going on? Yeah, that it's weird in that it also, there's the subtle implication in the article that basically Neil Blomkamp might have kind of cribbed at least the turning into the alien gun part of things for his District 9 movie.
Do you know, the impression I've got of Neil Blomkamp ever since Landfall and he wasn't working on the Halo movie is that the films he's been making, there's just been sort of aspects of Halo that he was going to implement in there. I mean, you know, Elysium has got a friggin' Halo ring in it, basically.
Yeah. Well, I've never, since I haven't talked to you about this, I want to digress briefly. Are you in the, I would have loved to have seen a Blomkamp Halo, or I am so happy that movie did not get made?
I am sort of in the middle between them because I can't remember some of the detail. I remember, like, wasn't there some very strange-looking Sangheili model that didn't look at all like a Sangheili that was going to be in that film? Yeah, there was some weird stuff. And I remember there being some strange stuff. I wouldn't have liked that, I don't think, but I'd have been interested to see, you know, from like a film perspective, how they would have handled the story and, you know, all the sort of building blocks of how you would translate Halo into a film format. Because I read the I think it's Alex Garland's script for the Halo 1 adaptation, and my God, the only way from there was up, to be honest.
I don't know. I personally liked, there's some weird quippy stuff, but I really love parts of it, like the whole intro with how, like, all right, we have to explain that he's the last of his kind and that they fled this horrible defeat on Reach, and this whole dream sequence, which I really like. And then some of the concessions they make to the fact that they have to alter the story since it's not a game, where they basically have Jenkins blow his face off in front of the Chief because he's so traumatized by the flood. That stuff's wild, but it actually works. The Chief Cortana thing gets kind of weird, creepy.
Yeah, and Fohammer as well. There's some kind of like weird kind of implied romance with Fohammer.
Yeah, that stuff wasn't as good, but personally, after seeing District 9, I was like, that was an interesting movie. I am so glad we did not see him do Halo, because like the shaky cam stuff and the gun point of view shots in that movie, I was like, oh man, this would have been in Halo and it would have been terrible.
Yeah.
I'm surprised anyone has an appetite for live action Halo after the amazing Nightfall experience.
I actually hold the unpopular opinion of quite liking Nightfall. By no means is it a great piece of Halo fiction at all, but I feel like there was a certain level of expectation as to what that story would be based on the setting, and I can completely understand why people are disappointed with that and a lot of the aspects in it. But I think it's got some great stuff in there.
I have not watched it since it came out. All I really remember was not liking it that much, being annoyed that it was a Golo instead of the Flood, and that the second stories were more interesting than what was going on in the actual...
That much I can definitely agree with, yeah.
Well, with the shoehorning in of a new Covenant species, that was...
beyond hit.
Mm-hmm. Like, just little things like that. Just why? Why did they do that?
Because they didn't want to spend money on the CGI for one of the actual Covenant races.
Yeah, where did you're the one who said that, like, weren't you the one who said that you had some, like, background scuttlebutt that they showed up at the thing and found out that Ridley Scott and company had basically created the alien, and so they had to backfill it?
That's exactly what happened. Yeah, Ridley Scott pushed for the new alien. It was his thing, and they couldn't turn him down because he refused to back down on it. So they said, "Fuck it, go for it."
The Covenant Fringe. So if that's true, it's amazing.
Yes, it's totally true. Totally true. I know it for a fact. Unfortunately,
if they'd actually done more with that and made it more interesting, I could have gotten behind it. But as it stands, it's just, you know, it's something that just exists.
Yeah.
Without much purpose or sort of, you know, beyond. It's a concept that's in there, and it's not really doing anything, and it hasn't done anything for about 3 years now.
Well, because if they didn't want to put it in the first place, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Cortana mentioned the on it in Halo 5. That counts.
Yeah, that's the breadcrumb.
Yeah.
We have references.
I tried to forget about that.
Okay, anything else about Halo 2?
Halo 2 was also a great game.
I never loved it. I know everyone says how great it was. I missed the online buzz for it. So I got to play it after playing Halo 1, and I was like, what is this mess? Why can't they do this? What the hell are these guns? I was not happy with Halo 2.
I liked the ending, personally. I apparently I'm part of a minority who felt that Halo 2 earned its cliffhanger ending, and I feel like the ending that they've described for how it would have gone forward didn't at all fit the tone and the theme of the overall game.
Yeah, it's kind of I guess that's something that comes up here. We always knew that there was a third a bit that got cut at the end of Halo 2 where Master Chief and Arbiter reunite and basically finish the fight by killing Truth at what was the Ark at that time, which became the portal to the Ark. I'm kind of it's like one of those things where, again, like hearing about it, it could have worked, but it's hard to say whether. Yeah. Because I think Halo 3, like, I love Halo 2's story. I hate replaying it, and I totally understand why people hated the Arbiter, because he gets terrible flood levels that I hate. And I love the flood in Halo CE. It just was always a chore in Halo 2. But it's hard to say whether or not it would have been better that way than Halo 3. Obviously, if they had ended it that way, we might not have gotten the franchise we love now. But it's hard to say. Because they had that cliffhanger due to necessity, we did get Halo 3.
We did. I wasn't personally all that happy with Halo 3 myself, but I do feel personally that it was preferable, if only for its setup for the future, to what they described Halo 2's ending was going to be. Because it just sounds like they sort of had the Covenant level from Halo 3, and they were going to have that as like the last mission of Halo 2, and that would be it.
Yeah, and I mean, because Halo 3 definitely feels like, oh, we have to turn this last level into a whole campaign, because the first third of the game, nothing is really happening from a narrative standpoint.
Yes.
But I think it earns its emotional ending. But here, the article goes into basically a lot more about the details of the Bungie Microsoft split. And here it also leans into the Bungie politics side, because it basically sounds like, once again, Jason Jones he had burned out so bad on Halo 2, he went off to do his own thing, but no one really knew what the hell was going on with him gone, besides the fact that they needed to make Halo 3. There were people who were behind, like these 7 people who were involved in all the negotiations with Microsoft, but they were siloed off from everyone else, so there was like this animosity of like, what's going on, like, what are we doing? That was interesting.
I mean, even Joe Staten took a sabbatical away, and he wasn't involved in the writing of Halo 3. He was a script editor at the end, and that was new information, because it's long been just sort of held like, oh yeah, Joe Staten, he did Halo 3, he did that story. But I've never felt that Halo 3's story really spoke to his sensibilities as a writer. It never felt like a Joe Staten story.
Yeah.
In terms of sort of the typical kind of bombastic action mixed with deep character drama that he tends to go for.
Well, and that's an interesting thing, because they talk about how it was kind of rudderless and no one really knew what the story was going to be and stuff. And it sounds like Marty...
Yeah, it was committees that were writing it, and then Marty came up with those 9 plot points.
And it's funny, because the resonance of him saying, we have to save Sergeant Johnson at the end, to in Halo 3, we have to kill these people off.
Yes.
So that's which honestly I would have been fine with if it hadn't been so lame.
Same with Miranda as well. I'm still very upset about her
Johnson
death,
less than Miranda. Miranda, like, and that gets into I think my biggest issue with Halo 3 is that cutscene, the cutscenes in the Covenant, and how they just seem weird on so many levels. Like Miranda,
it really feels like they were saying, we have to kill these people off, and they couldn't contrive the situation in a way that made total sense.
Well, it's like, so Miranda busted in there with no clear plan. Like, she didn't have any Marines in the back or anything like that. And like,
she didn't use the Pelican's guns.
Yeah, like,
or
that's
anything.
weird. And then like they find Truth at the end, and Master Chief. All right, well, first off, Johnson is just cradling Miranda and tells Master
why
Chief
isn't he beating the shit out of the Prophet of Truth?
Well, and why isn't he turning off the halos? And Master Chief just saunters over and turns off like the rings that are going to kill everyone imminently. It's like something about this is just whacked out. It's odd.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the whole Gravemind popping up to never reappear again. But
and Truth getting infected by the Flood as well. It's like, when did that happen?
just hand wave. Yeah, so I agree. So
yeah, it's sort of stuff that happens, and we just sort of take it as given because the presentation of the scene is good. And I feel that's Bungie kind of in a nutshell. Is, you know, if you look beneath the surface, there's a lot of flaws with their ideas, but the way in which they present them is resonant enough that people will accept it.
But the Halo 3 stuff and talking about their terms of divorce from Microsoft lead into the fact that they basically had to 3 buckets. They describe it as things they had to give back. And so at one point there was going to be this Chronicles game, like they were going to have Halo 4 was actually going to be the sequel to Halo 3. Yep. Which I don't remember if that was new or not.
Yes, that was actually told to us back by Marcus Leto back in 2010. 2010, 2011. Yeah, no, I remember because I referenced that article in a lot of arguments when it came to the natural kind of progression.
Right. Yeah, now I remember. Yeah, because they did mention at least at one point that it was going to be a sequel, and then they went another way.
Interestingly, when I spoke to Paul Russell, he said that as far as Halo 4 went, the idea came up in the studio saying, shall we do Halo 4? They said no. And then that was the end of it. So that's a kind of a different story. I think those tweets are still up there. So it's a bit of a different story, depending on the perspectives of which employees talking.
And that's definitely the grain of salt to take with all of this, as it is people recollecting things after the fact from a different perspective. So,
yeah.
Like, I really wish they had talked to Jason Jones about this, like, because I want to hear his impression, because everyone else kind of...
Maybe that's the next 35,000 word.
Everyone else kind of throws him under the bus in this. Like, yeah, Jason Jones screwed us. But so the Chronicles is interesting, but it falls apart. And that turns out to be ODST filling that bucket. And they briefly mention... I think an overarching thing about this too is that Bungie comes off worse, Microsoft comes off a little better, but then there's all these brief moments where and then Microsoft was the giant parent company doing what giant parent companies do and doing stupid things.
Yeah.
And they briefly touched on that with the fact that there's little things like how they, according to Marty, at some points they mentioned we had totally gone to legal with the name Dervish for the Arbiter, and then suddenly at the last minute they're like, no, you have to change this. It's too similar to the Prophet of Islam, and you've got all these parallels going.
Yes.
But so they end up saying, no, this expansion you're going to do is going to be a full price game. And how it seems that they're still a little salty about, like, it would have been so much better received if it hadn't been that, which I agree with.
I personally loved ODST. I still hold it in my favorite Halo games of all time. And I honestly myself felt that I got my money's worth for the full price that I spent.
Oh, yeah, totally.
But it was interesting because it's sort of that one shining light for the people who worked on it, isn't it? It's like they said, we had such a great time making this game, and then we had to, we had this hell that we had left behind us, this uncertainty of the future. And ODST was just this nice sort of intermediate period.
Yeah, and it kind of comes off from some of the recollections that it was sort of like the... inside, once again, like sort of this afterthought of Bungie, like, well, you guys are doing that, we don't, it's not interesting, it's not the new stuff we're gonna do, it's who cares about that. And those guys just had fun, put out, I think, one of the most consistent games, especially the campaign. It feels like greatest.
Oh, absolutely.
When they talk about Reach being the sort of recollections to the greatest hits of Halo campaigns past, I think ODST totally is much better.
ODST was like, it feels like that campaign was built from the ground up as a greatest hits of Halo, in terms of its mission structure, its themes overall, and how you approach the combat in it. It feels just wonderful to play compared to Reach, which I felt didn't have that same kind of spark to it personally.
Mm-hmm. And they have a brief bit in here about Staten, who actually had a lot of interesting things to say about the Master Chief. Way back in the CE part, they mentioned that one of their specific references of what not to do was Gordon Freeman from Half-Life, which, as a guy who has never liked the series because Gordon Freeman is a mute annoying, like worthless character was interesting to hear them say, like, well, we want to do something above that. He's going to be quiet, but he's still going to have some presence. And they mention talking about how they Staten really wanted to bring in more than just like grunting and stuff, and have the character speak, which they did through Dutch and all the other characters in ODST. And that's an interesting bridge to where 343 ended up taking the Master Chief in Halo 4 and characters beyond that.
Well, yeah, that's what I've been working on with my most recent articles, the Master Chief stuff, because there's been, you know, such a mix of approaches to his character, which have been very inconsistent over the years. And it's sort of the Halo 2-3 period where it was other people who were, you know, working on that particular character, where it sort of fell apart, I feel, and people had this very specific idea of the Chief that was almost like the Gordon Freeman kind of character in a way.
Mm-hmm. Like you were saying, it was the ODST story is kind of this like ray of sunshine in the realm of things. And another weird, like, again, like fan history. I mean, there are people who go on about Reach's story, and they touch on this with Marty basically saying, yeah, they tried for too many things and just did not create resonant characters.
I really appreciated that, because Bungie, I've been quite frustrated, like back in when they would do their retrospectives, because they would absolutely lambast Halo 2, but they would not say a bad word about Reach, and they would not sort of reflect critically on it. They would just sort of recycle old clips from the Vidocs and be like, what do you think about this game in retrospective? It's been so divisive to the community, and we're not really seeing their perspective on it. And finally, 7 years later, here we've got Marty saying, you know, yeah, we didn't really deliver on this particular aspect. And I was just like, thank you.
Yeah, and it really... It's weird that they talk about Reach as sort of like this obligation they had to do, so it was clearly not what a lot of people wanted to do. And there's this subtle thing about, well, all the cool talent is going to Destiny at the time, but also, and it's just weird because I think what especially with some of the pitfalls of 343's games, that like they release such at a time like crazy feature rich game. Like, oh man, there's all this attention, like all these crazy custom games. You got this firefight, there's all this, and like that never really comes up. It's all like, oh god, we got to put out the stupid thing for obligation. So it's an interesting dichotomy of like how a lot of people at Bungie seem to feel about it versus how the fans received it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Marty says is the Reach project was basically Halo 4 in terms of the pressure that the studio felt. It was Halo 4 in all but name in terms of, you know, what they were up against having to make.
Oh, and just one other interesting tidbit from the ODST part I wanted to bring out is that they have Joe Staten specifically mention the whole Sadie's story, Virgil, Dante's Inferno connection, which some people I know totally did not believe was intentional, bizarrely.
I don't know how you can not think that was intentional. It was so overt. And that's one of the things I liked about it.
We have a lovely article hosted that someone wrote up exactly making that. Yeah, that was a really good read at the time.
Yeah.
And it probably still is. That basically tied it all together.
Yeah, I'll have to repost it. Like that was, yeah, like once you looked at it, it's like, oh, it's totally there, especially down to the sins for all the people they meet. It's kind of crazy.
And how the 9th level in Data Hive is frozen over. Can you get more visually overt than that?
Hell isn't cold. What are you talking about? Someone's got to read the original Italian.
Oh.
So I think I don't know if you have anything else you want to mention about Reach, but I think it's an interesting wrap up, like we were talking about, sort of bringing a new shading to the Bungie story, I think, than we got before.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And then the story shifts over to the 343 side of things, which for a couple of reasons I don't think is as interesting overall. I don't know if you would disagree with that.
Yes, the Halo 4 stuff, I mean, I kept up very closely with Halo 4's development, because Halo 4 was a game that I had very much wanted to see, and I very much liked the sound of from the get-go. So there wasn't an awful lot of new. There was some new stuff in there. There was stuff that I knew, but Halo 4's development basically comes down to the base fact that we had to start this studio from scratch. We had to hire as we went. We had, by the time the project finished, they had about 200 employees, whereas the average AAA studio has about 300, and it was chaotic.
Yeah.
That was the general gist, really, to take from Halo 4. It wasn't quite Halo 2 tier chaotic, because their ideas coalesced a lot more naturally, I think, on Halo 4. But it was, hell for the company.
I think it does... probably one of the most interesting comments in retrospective is they have a little more about the 343 side of the history is a bit sketchy, because fans didn't really know 343 was a thing by that name until I think it was the same time we got the release for Halo Legends, right? It was Comic-Con.
Around then, yeah.
But it was this thing,
Legends, Evolutions,
creeping around all the way back in 2008, and they have a nice little bit sort of bridging the gap between Reach and 4, talking with that Frankie basically switched over because he liked Halo and he knew that Destiny was going in this RPG MMO style thing that he was not interested in, and Marty in a alternate universe might have ended up being the composer, and it seems like it was a possibility, but he just had at the time too much brand loyalty and was like, what are you doing?
Yeah,
you can't quit. And he tried to convince Frank to stay on, which is interesting.
Well, to be a fly on the wall during that conversation would have been interesting.
Yeah, and that Certain Affinity itself actually was pitching some game ideas to Microsoft and 343 in the early time before a lot of it got shelved for the games we ended up with. And the push for Waypoint actually ended up shelving some of that stuff.
Yeah, there's, that Halo 4 needed all hands on deck, really, which is, unsurprising as to why some of these things were shelved.
Yeah, but I think the big new wrinkle that this article adds to the story that, like you said, if you've been following, well, is that we get a lot more from Ryan Payton, the one-time creative director of Halo. And I think probably if I was going to pick random things in Halo stories that had set off people to go nuclear about things, was I'm not sure when it was that we got some of the Halo 4 postmortem stuff, but there was, quote, akin to the fact that, all right, we were really tough as a studio. We were trying to get everyone together. And so we said, all right, we're going to try and recreate this little chunk of perfect Halo. And we did that, and then we tossed it away. And at the time, people went apeshit about that. That it was
that was actually in the that was in the Return of the Forerunners Vidoc, actually, which came out before the game. Yeah. They alluded to that particular instance, and they showed it
and
off.
People were like, oh my god, how could they? And so this adds the interesting wrinkle of Ryan Payton, who was a Metal Gear Solid guy, and he has this great little quote about how Hideo Kojima basically just was interested in whether bullets could interact with the foliage on the Halo 3 level.
I laughed
and then
about
just walked away.
Great.
There's this subtle implication, if you read between the lines, that Microsoft was looking for talent and maybe just kind of picked this guy who was not ready for the role. And they just saw, oh, well, he's got this great pedigree, and then did not actually pay attention to the qualifications or what was going on. But the wrinkle that Ryan adds in his retelling is that everyone else was going for a quote unquote more traditional Halo, and he was the one who really wanted to blow it up completely.
Yeah.
So you have,
of course, that doesn't quite match the narrative of the time from the community, where Peyton left, of course, because his mother, I believe, had passed away, and he had suffered previously from depression. But also he he said that he had a vision for Halo 4 that he didn't feel he was equipped enough to deliver, and that 343 wanted to do something very different. And, you know how that sounds and how people are going to take that at face value, aren't they? It's like, oh, 343 want to mess it all up. They want to do it completely different. When the reality is, it was the other way around, is that 343 wanted this very more traditional kind of Halo, and Ryan Payton was the one who had a very different idea of where to take things.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to, I mean, this comes up all the time, especially in the 343 era, where people have left for whatever reason, and it becomes this conspiracy theory between the fans of like, well, it's possible his job is done and like he's moving on, like, or is it bad blood or something? And so it's interesting to finally get an actual confirmation versus like what becomes like sort of the fan lore of what we think happened. So that was interesting.
He alludes to an idea of his that is in the game in Halo 5. He doesn't say outright what it is, but I believe that those would be the non-combat missions that he's talking about.
Yeah, that was an interesting thing, that he apparently wanted entire sections of Halo 4's campaign to not have combat, which my mind initially went to, what if you just like walked through the whole librarians part at the beginning of Reclaimer? Like if that whole cutscene had sort of become a level instead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can't remember the source exactly, but there was some years ago, somebody said that they had this idea that they would have a didact mission, which involved the stuff in the terminals being explored by the player, and that was very much what came to mind, because there are parts of Halo 4 where there's not a lot of combat, where you are sort of just walking around between areas and exploring, and it would have been interesting to see, you know, where they would have gone with that if they really sort of like doubled down on some of Peyton's ideas for where that was going to go.
And honestly, I like those sections, like the
so do I.
The point right before the librarian cutscene in Reclaimer, I think, is probably, of all the games, the closest I get to coming back to that Halo 1 feeling of like, what the heck's going on, and like this wonder and exploration of just kind of wandering through these corridors that feel a lot like some of the original Halo CE sort of monolithic areas.
Yeah, for me, it's in the second mission, Requiem, where you enter the cartographer room for the first time. You know, you walk up that little walkway, the Sentinels appear, Legacy from the soundtrack starts playing, which is my favorite Halo track still. You got that, you know, that choir, and then you've got this beautiful cathedral-like structure being retaken by nature around sort of like one area, and there's, you know, all the Covenant dead bodies around. There's the Eld glyph where you can scan that and you learn about the mantle. It's just one of those beautiful world-exploring sections that I really felt Halo 4 did really quite a good job with.
Yeah. So it's interesting to hear those little bits about what might have been, but then it leads to, like, basically, all right, well, Ryan was gone and Josh Holmes came in and kind of performed a superhero thing, and it turned out better than anyone thought it had any right to be.
That's one thing I noticed actually in the 343 part especially, is that they seem a lot more sort of amicable towards one another. They're a lot more sort of receptive to you know, each other's ideas in a way that's not quite as overtly hostile as it seemed the Bungie way sort of went.
And that's one of the, I think, where to me, the 343 era stuff just doesn't have as much meat, partially because, like, yeah, these people are, at least at the time, everyone was still working together, like, and it's recent, so it's kind of harder to get, it's kind of unfair to compare, like, the level of candor that the Bungie guys have with what we get from the 343 section, just because it's totally different circumstance in a lot of ways.
You know, as I said, not as much drama going on, not as much difficulty in proving the series' existence. Rather, they've got the trouble of banding together to prove the need for its continued existence.
And then, like, the final short little bits, which, considering this was done a year ago, makes sense that they're so abbreviated. Briefly, just glosses over Master Chief Collection in Halo 5.
Yeah, we don't have a lot on that.
Obviously, fans want more. but we're gonna have to wait for part 2 of this or whatever.
Yeah. Or that list Frankie promised of, the breakdown of reasons for why things were the way they were that was promised some 3 years ago.
Yeah, well, and that gets into the thing of like how much candor are you going to get when like this is not an official Microsoft thing and these guys are still employed by them, like especially with the Master Chief Collection stuff. I think Bonnie Ross gave a much more detailed and like long mea culpa. This is totally our fault. It was stupid of us. We're gonna have betas going forward talk than anything in this about the Master Chief Collection specifically.
And thus far they've lived
and
up.
Also the other interesting thing I think was Josh Holmes actually gives the interesting quote that they were talking about how they realized if they're going to do Warzone, they still needed the arena and learning the mistakes from Halo 4's multiplayer. But having both of these in one game was a mistake. And what you take from that is interesting because Warzone has clearly made them a lot of money. It ain't going nowhere. So if you're
definitely
the classic BTB fan, this might worry you.
Which is a shame, yeah, because
I've been worried for years.
It is one of the weirdest, the weird little quirks too of like going from Halo 4 to Halo 5 was I remember when people were complaining so much about how Halo 4 BTB was how all they were focusing on. It was the most popular mode. And then in Halo 5 everyone was complaining about how it's all Forge maps and no one cares about BTB over there, etc. So it's kind of funny.
It's just like they can't win no matter what they do.
Well, and that's I think they sort of close out. They have Jamie Grayson come back, and he kind of brings up the fact that like, yeah, the overarching theme of this article is game development is hard. Jamie, it's interesting that he mentions basically he thinks that 343 should push it harder, and that he thinks that they've sort of hosed themselves by sticking too much to what they think Bungie would have done, which is an interesting perspective that I think lots of fans would not agree with as they yell about. So that was an interesting little line from a Bungie person. Like, no, don't do that.
Yeah, back in 2014-15, one of the E3s, then he was him and Marty did an interview, and he said very much the same thing, that what he hopes 343 will do with Halo is that they will push it forward, they will do something different. And that's sort of been his sort of idea of the prerequisite for the series' quality.
It's interesting continue. On the other hand, it also is easy for him to say because he's not focused on the same 30 seconds of fun kind of thing. If you build a series on that, people kind of expect that same base experience. Otherwise, they get cranky.
Indeed. Well, I mean, even Bungie sort of, when they made Strays, and people complained very much about that. I remember when Reach was shown off at E3 in 2010, they showed off the space battle. There was even kind of a backlash against that. So it's something that even Bungie wasn't, foreign to.
Looking at Reach now, I'm like, the space battle was like the least big change, and like, I like that.
I was always a fan of it. It felt very much like the old Rogue Squadron games. They nailed the sort of similar feel in terms of control, and so good.
My issue but my issue with that, I was actually thinking about this earlier, specifically the difference between Reach and Halo 4's space stuff is that Reach is the same every single time over, the same enemies, the same long periods of waiting around for enemies to spawn, the same sort of like, not really much to do there. Whereas 4's broadsword run, it's a classic kind of trench run. It's got more of a sort of like immediate mood to it. There's various sort of routes you can go. It's more linear, it's more contained slice, but there's more that they can sort of do with that, I feel, than there was with Reach's
the comparison
battle,
to Rogue Squadron versus Halo 4 is much more like a Star Fox or an Iridian or like any of those shooter screen, like just you've got your designated path and it's avoiding projectiles and going at it that way. It's definitely a different perspective, but I would like more space combat. But then that gets into the whole, like, hey, you could have a Halo space combat game. Well, that wouldn't be a shooter.
We almost did with Chronicles.
And they certainly prototyped it for Reach as well, which was shown in the deleted content video that they did some years ago. Mm.
Oh, wasn't that one of the hunters that you could ride or something and control a hunter?
Yeah, you could ride Moas. You could do Moa jousting.
Will.
That didn't happen.
Yeah, and they had those huge brute chieftains as well for some reason.
What I really love about the Halo 2 armor is like that the elites had that arrowhead shaped profile, and then in all the other games they started washing it down.
Yeah.
Like, no, like also then everything on Legendary, you like almost never seen elite minor. They're all the like annoying ones that drop kick you as soon as you try and go for melee.
Yeah, I think the Covenant really sort of lost their design philosophy in a way from Halo 1 and 2, because going back and having replayed those games very recently, as I often do, the difference between how the Covenant plays is pretty staggering.
One of those things where, like, man, like, I remember when people were like Halo2sucks.com, like people were crazy about how drastic the changes were. And now it's kind of like, oh, well, there were some changes, but the changes in Halo 5 are drastic. And it's like, we've gone through this every single game about, like, how much have they changed? Like, how much does it mean in the grand scheme of things? It's just the eternal fan cycle of hype and disappointment and outrage.
Naturally, yeah. I've grown very much indifferent to it, because it used to be something that would sort of tick me off, but it's just sort of like, yeah, we're going through the motions again. I feel like this old man sat in a rocking chair just looking at these, just looking at a bunch of people having a tantrum over these things, and we've gotten used to it because we've lived through it so many times.
Do we have anything else we want to cover then?
I think is there any other? There was some Halo 5 stuff, wasn't there? There was not an awful lot, but we've not had an awful lot of Halo 5 post-mortem stuff at all in the year and a half that it's been since that particular game came out, especially where the story is concerned.
Yes, and we know you have some bugbears there. Well, I think that's definitely something we'll either directly before Halo 6 comes out or after Halo 6 comes out is when we'll start seeing the floodgates, if not open, just slowly leak out. It'll be interesting to see. And
I suppose that brings us to the question of when do you reckon that's going to be?
As we are recording, and I assume, unless I'm crazy, this will be out. Oh, actually, what time is E3? E3's coming up, right?
Next week, I think.
Maybe.
Next week or a week out.
Okay, depending on when you hear this, listeners, I might have been really fast with editing or really lazy. In which case, you will know more than us, but I'm going to guess Halo 6 doesn't get anything more than just basically like name drop teaser, if anything.
Why don't they just announce it with a cinematic trailer that has no relevance to the main game like they always do?
Because thus far it seems that E3 this year is going to be another Halo Light year, in that we're getting some glimpse at Halo Wars 2 campaign DLC and not much else.
Which, I'm excited for Halo Wars 2 campaign DLC.
Yeah, same here. I really enjoyed Halo Wars 2, and I've got my level-by-level analysis coming up at some point in the near future, hopefully, which will be a project to
I can't wait for Kiki to come out and tell us all about the amazing Halo TV show that's being worked on, and we'll find out more details soon.
I mean, it has been. It was one of those things where, like, all right, it's totally not dead because they keep on like specifically mentioning it. But I think like the last time they specifically mentioned it was now like maybe late 2015. So it's now entirely possible it is dead.
I honestly think they keep
good if it's happening.
I honestly think they just wheel Kiki out to remind everyone about the TV show, and then wheel her back out in the backstage. Like every year, it's just, do we need to wheel her out again? Okay, there we go. Put her out. Halo TV. Bye.
Well, it was Bonnie who originally announced it, I think, on stage E3 2014. So
Yeah, like why bother? Why bother
Real
doing
quick.
that? It's like, have you got something to show? Do you have a trailer for us? No, don't fucking talk about it then.
okay, well, so that's the like pie in the sky hope is that there's a Spielberg Halo TV trailer. Like you heard it here, folks. It could happen.
I can't wait for more big name
Been 4
directors. They can attach to projects that never come out. Like, just think about all these directors who are not currently doing Halo, who could not do Halo again in the future.
Well, wait. Think about it. Take this for a second. Steven Spielberg. Okay. Ridley Scott. Okay. Who's the obvious third person we're missing? That's right. George Lucas Halo production.
Oh, yeah.
The Spartan's power is actually caused by midichlorians, and
I can imagine Cody Miller getting fired up by another Is Not Canon website.
Halo, the prequel trilogy, is not canon.net.
Oh, good. No, I expect to see Halo at E3 in some form. If they come to showing Halo Wars 2 shit, no one's going to care. Like, don't make Halo any more irrelevant than it currently is, please, by doing that. Announce a numbered game. That's all you have to do. It's not hard.
Okay. Well, anything else you want to do before we wrap up?
I think we've covered all the bases there, haven't we? Pretty much.
Okay, then we'll close things out. Thanks for being on. I assume you would like to tell people where they can see your writings and such.
Well, I frequent the Halo archive. I have done for many years, which is sort of my mainstay for the community. And I of course have my own blog website at haruspis.wordpress.com, where I will be rolling out hopefully soon a analysis of the Master Chief's characterization in Halo 4. And we've got the Halo Wars 2 level by level analysis coming up in the near future. So stay tuned for that.
Yep, and we've got a few things in the pipeline on our side too, so stay tuned for that. And thanks a lot, Haruspis, for joining us.
No problem.
You can check us out at forwardontodon.com. The show notes will be at forwardontodon.com/FUDcast22. You can check us out on Twitter at forwarddon and at YouTube at forwarddon. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys next time.